programs. These might be codified, structured interventions, such as catch-up numeracy, which is one that we funded as part of the transition round, and we published the evaluation in February. Now, we fund a variety of these practices, programs, and interventions. So, on the far left, we've got something like Challenge the Gap, which is Challenge Partners based in London, and they're talking about getting groups of schools together to talk about research and challenge each other on implementation. That's just broad principles of grouping together. There's no specific structure to that. A little bit further along the spectrum, we've got the Carol Dweck growth mindset stuff, which again is a bit more prescriptive, but overall it's a broad set of principles about how you communicate with pupils to get them into a growth mindset. Similarly, philosophy for children, about cognitive development and reflection. And then on the far right, we've got a very, very structured program that's come from the States, very popular in the States, interestingly less so here, but it's a whole school reform approach called Success for All, where it's a turnaround for failing schools. And it's a very, very structured, codified implementation strategy. There are very definite things that you need to do to make Success for All work. A little further back, we've got something like Catch-Up Numeracy, which, again, is a very structured program, but perhaps not so much so that you can't deviate from it. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the catch-up findings, which this table is taken from our evaluation report that some of you may be familiar with. It's quite a challenging finding, because what we found, actually let me tell you a bit about catch-up, just as a context. It's a teaching assistant intervention over 30 weeks, 2 15-minute slots with underachieving year 2 to 6 pupils. And over the course of those 30 weeks, our trial suggests that catch-up numeracy versus the control group makes a significant impact on their attainment. 0.21, which we converted to 3 months of additional progress. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a time equivalent one-to-one group. So TAs delivering the same amount of time over the 30 weeks, but they just weren't following the catch-up numeracy program. And they actually made more gains than the catch-up numeracy program. So how are we to interpret this? Well, catch-up numeracy, so our trial suggests, is effective. But compare it to the TA one-to-one support, suggests it's less effective. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do catch-up numeracy, but what I am saying in this is that it seems that the one-to-one tuition, the key active ingredients of one-to-one tuition, seem to be easier to get working than something that is a bit more structured, such as catch-up numeracy. Now, that's quite a challenge for developers who are doing these kind of programs, because we're saying, let's develop programs that give enough flexibility for teachers to implement it without you having to follow a very, very specific set of rules that's quite easy to deviate from. So that's quite a challenge for developers who are coming to us. We need to know that there is enough flex in the program, that it's not so structured that one little deviation from the program means that you don't see any of the achievement levels. Now, quite what it takes to get those things working, how you implement something like feedback effectively, or catch-up numeracy effectively, is something that is a big question mark. We actually don't know how you should support teachers in the classroom to implement the evidence base. And that's one of the reasons why the research use round is trying to do. So in the trials that we fund, we will fund various levels of support to see quite how much support you need to give. You can either peel it back so that you just go light touch or go really intensive support. So the first stage, if you like, what happens if we just communicate the principles of effective implementation to schools? What happens if we just tell them about it? Is that enough to see gains? Perhaps not. So maybe there's a brokerage service, somebody on the end of a phone, somebody who knows, maybe the developer who is implementing, who has developed this, and can talk to the schools about implementing and how to get it working in their schools. If not, then we're really talking about a pretty intensive coaching model of bespoke support, where the person who literally comes into the school and helps them get that intervention working. And that requires very, very careful consideration of the school context and the particular challenges of the pupils in the classroom. So this is part of the ongoing work of the researchED round. How much support is required to implement effectively? Come back to the support issue. I want to give you an example from a really interesting study that was done in 1981 and is coming in a forthcoming work by Dean William. It talks about the fidelity to the model. What happens if you deviate from the model that is being promoted as evidence-based? There were 6 video clips of someone performing CPR. 5 of the clips were of students that were learning CPR, and 1 was of an expert paramedic. And these 6 clips were shown to 3 groups of people. Expert paramedics, students learning CPR, and CPR instructors. And they were asked the question, who would you want performing CPR on you? The results are fascinating. The experts picked the expert 90% of the time. They could identify an expert doing CPR. Students, as you'd expect, couldn't half the time. They only picked the expert 50% of the time. The instructors only picked the expert 30% of the time. These are the people who are training people to do CPR, but they couldn't identify the expert, or maybe they could, but they still chose the expert only 30% of the time. And the researchers concluded that the instructors were looking for people who were enacting the rules of CPR, all the official codified things that you must do when you're taught how to do it. And the experts could identify which were the essential core elements of CPR, but they could identify who had adapted CPR models slightly and were doing it in their own slightly idiosyncratic way. But it was still recognisable as CPR, and of course it was still effective in saving someone's life. Now that's, I think, the challenge for us and for developers. It's to make evidence-based interventions and approaches something that is adaptable enough to get working in schools, to allow us as individual teachers to still teach in the way that we want, in the style that we choose, but still seeing significant gains from an evidence-based approach. Now, if we're all implementing these evidence-based approaches, programs, in our own way, how do we know it's working? We're suggesting that teachers become as skilled in evaluation in their school. And again, you might be familiar with this. We've published a DIY guide with Durham University on our website to encourage schools to create a comparison group. And whether that's a randomised controlled trial, or a matched group, or even just a simple comparison group, Nevertheless, it's important to have that comparison group so that you know whether you're having impact or not. We can talk a bit more about that at the end if people are interested in the DIY guide. Just to flag it up, we are currently working with Durham to create a new version, an interactive version, which will be much easier to use than the current guide, which is just a PDF downloadable document on the website. So watch this space. We'll hopefully be launching that within the next 9 months or so. So to finish then, what are the next steps for an evidence-informed profession? Thinking about Lee's quadrant and trying not to slip back into the uninformed profession or the ignorant profession. I'm suggesting that the 4 areas that I've outlined today are important. Access, so communicating research, and the EF and others have a very important role in ensuring that schools get access to research. But what I'm saying about teachers and the skills of teachers is that the implementation and the evaluation of that implementation are the key things that teachers should become skilled in. So rather than identifying the what of what works, I'm saying teachers should become skilled, become experts in the how of how it works and evaluating that as they go. Bottom left quadrant is the support, which I didn't really touch upon, partly because there's a big question mark. We actually don't know how much support is needed, but we do know that schools are critical in supporting their teachers through inset, through ongoing training. And evidence so far suggests that very, very few schools know how to support the teachers in implementing something effectively. I've rattled through that because I did want to leave a decent amount of time for questions. I think we have about 18 minutes or so to discuss anything that Lee or I have said, or anything about the toolkit or the work of the EF. We're really happy to take questions.
I might word this badly because it's a Saturday, but in your slide where... Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yep. DIY.
No, previous. It was about the research and if you slightly change the model. So the CPR.
The CPR, yeah.
Yeah, that was it, sorry.
Yeah.
So that research suggests that it's okay to change the model even though the model is based on research and you can change it. But the key thing is changing it in a skillful way, in a thoughtful way. And is there anything, have you identified that as somewhere where schools would need help in the implementation?
Yeah. Steve Higgins, who created the toolkit, talks about educational interventions being fragile. That we have an idea of what works or what has worked in the past through RCTs, that's the value of them. But even so, implementing them in your own context is still fragile and fraught with difficulty on the balance between the model, fidelity, the core elements, and adapting to your particular context. And that is the balance that we don't know really, and it's essential to try and find out. And that's why we're encouraging schools, if they're going to implement an evidence-based approach, that they evaluate constantly as they go in a rigorous way, so that they can identify that this department are doing it in this way, this department are doing it in this way, and we can somehow get an evaluation of which is the most effective method.
So you have to change it slightly, but also do research on the slight changes and have
exactly, yeah, and that's why I'm saying that teachers really, although then they shouldn't be doing the what of what works, it's the how of how it works. So they are doing research on the implementation rather than the does this crazy innovation that I've developed work. It's the implementation of the evidence base.
It's the way you do it. So that's been our
Thank you.
Can I just pick up on that one about rescue? And there's instead of CPR,
Yeah.
trial on encouraging, there's an RCT on encouraging mothers in West Bengal to rescue. And they found that a particular way of communicating to them would raise them.